A massive flood strikes a remote rural town. As the humans evacuate, dozens of stranded animals, pets, livestock, even wild creatures are left behind. The roads vanished beneath rising water. Power lines sparked and fell. Sirens wailed through the narrow hills as families scrambled for high ground, clutching what they could carry. But not everything could be taken. Fences broke, leashes snapped, and one by one the animals were left, some by accident, others by heart-wrenching necessity. A golden retriever howled from a rooftop, refusing to abandon the porch where she last saw her family. A baby goat stood trembling inside a flooded barn, its cries barely heard over the wind. And deep in the forest, even wild creatures, deer, foxes, birds, gathered on small patches of dry earth, surrounded by water on all sides. No one saw them at first. No one knew who was still out there, until someone did. They didn't plan to become heroes. Most of them were just neighbors, farmers, retirees, high school kids with days off and nowhere to go. But when the floodwaters didn't stop and the sky kept pouring, something changed. It started with a single message in a local group chat. "There's a dog trapped on the roof of the old gas station." Within minutes, someone grabbed a kayak, another brought rope, and suddenly they weren't just evacuating, they were rescuing. Barns had become islands, fields were lakes, and every animal that hadn't been taken with their owners now stood in rising water, trembling with fear and confusion. Horses in stables whinnied for help, chickens clung to the tops of fences. A deer with a broken leg limped through the flooded orchard, barely able to move. The official rescue teams were overwhelmed, focused on the people. So the townspeople made their own plan. They mapped out where animals had last been seen. They used fishing boats, canoes, even inner tubes tied to pickup trucks. A retired vet turned her basement into a triage center. A teenager built an online map for people to report sightings. Someone's grandfather held the flashlight for hours while a group of soaked volunteers lifted a newborn calf from a barn submerged to the windows. One by one, the animals were brought in. A piglet shivering under a tarp. A flock of geese rescued from a trailer roof. A kitten with its paws cut on broken glass, who still purred when wrapped in a child's jacket. No one asked whose they were. It didn't matter. What mattered was that they were alive, that someone had shown up, that someone had said, "You are not forgotten." And that began to ripple outward. What started as a desperate mission to save a few pets turned into something far greater. Strangers began showing up with boats not to leave, but to help. A man who had just lost his home brought blankets and food for the rescued animals. A woman who couldn't swim waded waist-deep through muddy water with a crate of baby ducks clutched to her chest. People who had never spoken to each other before were now shoulder to shoulder, hauling goats from flooded fields, coaxing frightened dogs out of trees, or building makeshift shelters out of whatever they could find. No one had planned for it, no one had rehearsed, but it was as if some silent agreement had passed between them all. If we can't save everything, we'll save what we can. And so they did, by the dozens, by the hundreds, with tired arms and soaked shoes, and hearts too full to rest. Someone donated all the hay in their barn. Someone else set up heat lamps in a shed for newborn lambs. A young boy, maybe 10, stood guard over a group of trembling rabbits, feeding them dandelion leaves and whispering, "You're safe now," over and over like a prayer. And the animals, they responded. Shivering stopped. Eyes softened. Even the wild ones began to trust. The town was no longer just surviving. It was transforming, not just into a place of safety, but into something sacred. A living, breathing reminder that kindness isn't a luxury in the face of disaster. It's a lifeline. And in that moment, it didn't matter that the power was out or the streets were still rivers. What mattered was that someone had stayed. Someone had listened. Someone had acted. And because of that, lives were not only saved, they were honored. Not just with safety, but with dignity. Each life pulled from the floodwaters was treated not as a burden, but as a being worth the effort. The trembling dog with one eye, wrapped in a dry towel and rocked like a baby. The limping cow stranded on a concrete porch, led slowly, gently, through the rising water by two teenagers who had never touched livestock before in their lives. The owl, wet, terrified, clinging to a telephone wire, lifted down with careful arms and cradled beneath an umbrella until the rain eased. And somewhere in all of that chaos, something else began to rise. Something even stronger than the current. Community. Not the kind built by proximity, but the kind built by action. People showed up for creatures who could never say thank you. They stayed not because they were asked, but because it was right. And in doing so, they found something of themselves in the eyes of those they helped. Grief didn't disappear. Loss still lingered. Some homes were beyond saving. Some memories were soaked beyond repair. But what they built in the midst of it all, rescue stations, feeding lines, warm places where shivering bodies could breathe again, that was real. That was theirs. And for every animal that looked back with quiet, trembling eyes, something passed between them. Something sacred, a mutual understanding. You mattered enough to fight for. You are not alone. And that was enough. Enough to keep going, enough to rebuild, enough to believe that in a world that often forgets its softest voices, there are still people who will listen. Still people who will reach back into the water. Not because it's easy, but because it's needed. Because compassion isn't measured by convenience, it's measured by presence. By who shows up when the headlines fade. By the quiet hands that still carry food to muddy fields days after the cameras are gone. By the neighbor who leaves her porch light on for stray cats that no longer have a home. By the boy who checks the barn 3 times a night just in case the doe with the broken leg decides to return. They didn't do it for recognition. They did it because it was unbearable to know someone was afraid and alone and do nothing. Because in the stillness that followed the storm, they realized something simple and devastating. These animals had no words, no warnings, no escape plans. Only trust. Trust that someone, anyone, might care enough to come back. And they did. In boots soaked through, in trucks caked with mud, in makeshift rafts and trembling arms, in soft, breaking voices whispering, "It's okay now. I've got you." It didn't matter if it was a chick or a stallion, a house cat or a fox caught in barbed wire. Every creature was seen. Every heartbeat mattered. Not because they could give something back, but because they were there, because they were alive. And in that moment, as the floodwaters slowly pulled away and the sun returned like an apology, the town looked different. Not in ruins, but in revelation. They had saved more than lives. They had saved the belief that goodness can rise even in disaster, that it can take root in soaked soil, that it can bloom quietly and bravely in every act of mercy that follows chaos. Something deeper took hold, something that couldn't be measured in numbers or headlines. It was in the way strangers became neighbors again, in how fences no longer marked property lines, but became perches for drying wings and resting paws. It was in the quiet return of balance, not just in nature, but in the people themselves. Because when you save a life that cannot ask to be saved, you remember something primal and pure about your own humanity. Children who once ran past the fields without notice now stopped to listen for the sound of hooves or chirps. Elderly hands that had grown stiff with time now held baby opossums with the care of cradling a heartbeat. And the man who had once scoffed at the idea of a wild thing needing love wept openly when the stray dog he carried out on his back finally wagged her tail again. The flood had stolen much. Homes, crops, memories that could never be remade. But it had given something too. It had revealed who they were when everything else was stripped away. Not survivors, not victims, but caretakers, witnesses, protectors of life too often unseen. And slowly they built again. Not just houses, but trust. Not just barns, but sanctuaries. And not just for animals, but for themselves. Because every small creature that made it, every shivering lamb, every mud-covered kitten, every bird that took flight again, became a testament. That kindness, even when exhausted, still answers. That compassion, even when overlooked, still chooses to stay. And in that truth, the town did not return to what it was before. It became something better, not just rebuilt, but reborn. Because the flood hadn't only swept through streets and fields, it had broken open the hearts of those who lived there. It had reminded them what it meant to look out for one another, not just across fences and front porches, but across species, across silence, across fear. And that kind of shift, the kind born not from speeches or policies, but from muddy hands lifting frightened bodies, stuck. Weeks turned into months, and yet people still paused when they heard a cry in the underbrush. They still left out bowls of water on their porches, not just for pets, but for any living thing that needed a moment of grace. And in the schoolhouse that had once been nearly abandoned, children now painted murals of dogs and deer, of cats and cranes, all under rainbows, not to forget the storm, but to honor what came after. Some of the animals never left. They became part of the community in ways no one expected. A goat wandered freely between gardens. A heron took up watch near the church bell. A once feral cat curled up each night beneath the mayor's desk. These weren't rescues anymore. They were family. They were proof that something sacred had passed through the town. Not just water, but a revelation that the measure of any place isn't in how high the waters rise, but in how deep the kindness runs, and how far it's willing to reach. Because kindness, once awakened, doesn't go back to sleep. It moves quietly, persistently, through conversations, through open doors, through the way people now slowed when they saw something small and scared. The floodwaters had receded long ago, but something else had risen in their place. A deeper awareness, a gentler rhythm, a town that no longer turned away from the helpless, but leaned in. And it wasn't just the adults who changed. It was the children who remembered the names of every dog rescued from a rooftop, the teenagers who organized food drives not for people, but for animals, the elderly man who, for the first time in decades, let a bird nest in his mailbox because he said, "If it's safe for her, it's safe for me too." The community had grown, not in size, but in soul. They had learned that strength didn't roar. It showed up with open arms, with blankets, with patience. And in time, the town became known for something other than tragedy. It became a place of sanctuary, a refuge not just from storms, but from indifference, a place where no cry was ignored, no life too small to matter, and all because, in the face of destruction, someone had chosen to care. And then another, and then another. Until the town itself became a chain of compassion, each link forged in moments that once felt too small to matter, until they did. Until the woman who'd never owned a pet took in a stray cat and cried when it finally purred. Until the boy who once feared animals stood beside a wounded deer, holding a bowl of water with hands steadier than anyone expected. Until the farmer who had once cursed the loss of his barn built a shelter not for tools, but for creatures who had nowhere else to go. It didn't happen all at once. Healing never does. But slowly it spread. In the way fences were replaced by open gates, in the way silence was broken by laughter, by barking, mewing, fluttering wings, in the way the town square now held not just markets and meetings, but feeding stations and shaded spots for recovery. The animals had returned, not because they had nowhere else to go, but because they knew somehow they were safe here. And the people, they had changed too. Because once you save something that couldn't ask for help, it rewires you, makes you more attentive, softer in your steps, fiercer in your protection. And that shift, quiet, invisible, but undeniable, became the heartbeat of the town. No longer just a place on a map, but a symbol, a promise, a whisper that echoed, "Here kindness lives." Not in speeches or ceremonies, but in how the town moved forward. In how the girl who once stood on her rooftop during the flood, clutching her puppy in the rain, now ran a sanctuary for orphaned animals behind her school. In how the older couple who had nearly lost everything now left out food every evening for the raccoons and possums that had wandered back. In how every child in town could tell you the names of the dogs rescued from the shelter that day, as if they were old friends returning from a long journey. The town wasn't perfect. Some wounds didn't heal all the way. Some homes were never rebuilt. But something deeper had been restored. Something that couldn't be swept away, no matter how high the waters had risen. a belief that they had done something that mattered, that they had chosen compassion over convenience, that they had redefined what it meant to be a community, not by who lived there, but by who they were willing to stand for when everything else was falling apart. Because that's the thing about kindness, it lingers. It roots itself in the ordinary and waits. Waits for the next flood, the next fire, the next moment when someone must decide whether to look away or to open the door. And in that town, after everything they'd been through, they already knew the answer. Because once you've watched a soaked cow stumble into the arms of a stranger who didn't even ask if it was theirs, only if it was scared, you stop questioning what matters. You stop waiting for permission to care. In the weeks that followed, no one needed to debate whether animals felt or understood or belonged. The evidence had already stood at every street corner, hooves trembling, feathers soaked, paws clawing at closed doors, until someone opened theirs. And in that opening, something far more sacred had passed between them. Trust. Silent, ancient, wordless trust. It wasn't about saving them because they were useful, or beautiful, or even known. It was about something purer. They were there. They were breathing. And that was enough. So the town remembered. They painted murals of horses running through rain. They planted trees where rescue boats had once floated. They held moments of silence, not just for those they'd lost, but for those they'd learned to see differently. And when the rains came again, as they always do, the people didn't ask if they should help. They simply moved. Moved with the memory of what it felt like to hold something small and afraid and know you had a choice. Turn away or make space. They had chosen to make space, and that space had made them whole. Because the flood hadn't just drowned their streets, it had revealed their hearts, not just in the chaos, but in the aftermath. In the quiet, unspectacular days that followed, when there were no cameras, no applause, no headlines, just muddy boots beside muddy paw prints, just fences mended not out of obligation, but out of a newfound understanding that some lives aren't lesser just because they don't speak our language. In that silence, the town didn't return to normal, because normal had once meant forgetting. Normal had once meant separation, between us and them, between wild and tame, between worth saving and worth overlooking. But now, there were no such lines. Goats wandered in public gardens without fear. Stray dogs were given names, not numbers. A barn was rebuilt not for profit, but to shelter whatever creature needed it next. And in school, the children told stories not of monsters or heroes, but of the time a soaked kitten led rescuers to a den of fox cubs trapped beneath debris. Of how the oldest man in town carried a chicken under his coat for 3 days straight, whispering that no heartbeat would be left behind. The flood had not spared them, but it had offered them a different kind of wealth, the kind measured not in what you keep, but in what you choose to save. And that choice, it had reshaped their entire world, not with force, but with feeling, not by washing everything away, but by revealing what was worth keeping. Because in the days that followed, they began to see differently. A farmer didn't just see a stray dog anymore. He saw a survivor. A child didn't just hear birdsong. She listened, as if nature was now something speaking to her, not around her. Even the mayor who once passed by wandering animals with indifference now paused at the sound of hooves or the flash of feathers. Because once you've looked into eyes that nearly gave up and realized you had the power to change that story, it changes how you move through the world. And so, fences were rebuilt not to keep life out, but to keep it safe. Water bowls sat beside mailboxes. Wildlife crossings were cleared by hand. The word community stopped meaning just the people who live here and started meaning all of us who call this place home. Because once the flood came, the question was never who belongs, it was who needs us. And that answer still echoes through every tree, every field, and every open door led to another act of welcome. Not just for people, but for the quiet paws and trembling wings that had once been forgotten. Barns became shelters, sheds became sanctuaries. Back porches became places of healing. And no one asked what kind of animal, or whether it was wild or tame. They only asked, is it alone? Is it scared? Does it need us? Because something had shifted in them, something that didn't fade when the waters did. Compassion had taken root in the flooded soil and bloomed stronger than ever before. It showed up in the smallest gestures, a child placing a dry towel on a hedgehog's back, an old man fixing a fence, not for livestock but for the deer that now passed safely each morning. Neighbors who barely spoke before now coordinated rescue efforts, traded animal feed, and shared stories because saving together had made them family. What the flood destroyed, kindness rebuilt. And what kindness rebuilt wasn't just structures, it was trust, it was connection. Came the most profound transformations. Because once you've looked into the eyes of something terrified and realized it's looking to you for safety, you don't forget that. It changes how you walk through the world, how you notice the limping cat in the alley, how you slow down for the squirrel on the road, how you leave water out in summer, not just for dogs, but for the unseen thirsty. Children grew up differently after that flood. They learned that bravery doesn't always wear uniforms or shout commands. Sometimes it crouches in the mud beside a shaking lamb. Sometimes it speaks gently to a soaked owl perched on a broken fence. And those same children? They started to teach their parents, reminding them what empathy really looks like. Small, persistent, and without expectation. Even long after the waters had dried, the town kept noticing, kept responding. Birthdays included donations to animal shelters. Town meetings opened with a moment for lost wildlife, and local schools built sanctuary corners, teaching students not just to read and write, but to care. Because somewhere in the disaster, they had learned a deeper lesson, that the measure of a community isn't in its buildings or borders, but in how wide it's willing to open its arms. It was a new way of being, with each other and with the lives they once overlooked. And the town, once just a name on a map, became a symbol. Not of tragedy, but of how compassion can flood a place and leave something even more powerful behind. They didn't rebuild the same way. They rebuilt better, with animal-safe shelters, emergency plans that included every life, and signs at the city limits that didn't just say welcome, they said, "You're safe here." Because safety had become a promise, one that extended beyond species, beyond language, beyond fear. It lived in the grain store turned sanctuary, in the volunteer firehouse that now trained kids how to rescue, not just people, but the forgotten, the feathered, and the four-legged. In every raised hand that didn't ask, "What's in it for me?" but "What more can I do?" And in every animal that had once been left behind, but was now remembered, sheltered, and cherished, there was proof. Proof that when people choose to care collectively, not just when it's convenient, but especially when it's hard, they don't just save others, they save themselves. Because in saving others, those with paws, hooves, wings, and silent eyes, they rediscovered the most human part of themselves. The part that remembers how to pause for a trembling creature, how to listen to the cries that don't come in words, how to reach out, even when soaked to the bone and afraid. And those moments, those quiet, unspectacular choices, became the pillars of a new kind of town. A town where kindness wasn't a headline. It was the ground you walked on, where people taught their children not just how to read and write, but how to kneel beside a scared dog, how to lift a stranded calf, how to share a blanket with a wild thing that used to flee at the sound of boots. They didn't forget the flood, but they refused to let it define them in loss. Instead, they built a legacy of compassion so strong that even the animals seemed to know they were safe here. And that legacy, it didn't stay contained to that valley. It echoed out in letters sent to other towns, in photos of rescued lives taped to community boards, in stories whispered at night beside warm fires about how once, when it mattered most, humans remembered how to be human again. And that remembering, fragile, stubborn, and quiet, became the foundation for something far stronger than the storm that had once drowned their streets. They didn't rebuild exactly what was lost. Instead, they built what had been missing long before the waters came, a sense of shared responsibility, not just for each other, but for every life that had once been easy to ignore. There were no blueprints for this kind of healing, No government aid that could measure the value of a rooster gently carried on someone's back, or a soaked kitten wrapped in a volunteer's scarf. But that didn't matter, because the town had discovered a currency of care, a wealth built on time, attention, and the quiet labor of love. And as the seasons changed and the land dried, what remained wasn't just resilience, it was reverence. For the bond between a child and the stray they'd saved. For the unspoken trust in the eyes of a once wild animal who no longer ran. For the town that had stopped looking away and had chosen instead to see. And in that seeing, they didn't just survive. They became something worth being part of. Because now every sunrise didn't just mark another day survived. It marked another day someone was still choosing to care. The town was quieter than it had once been. Some homes remained empty, some roads still scarred. But what filled the silence wasn't sorrow. It was purpose. Footsteps echoing to the barn earlier than before. Small hands placing bowls outside doorsteps. Grown men speaking gently to animals they once ignored. They hadn't just remembered how to be human, they had redefined it. Not by rebuilding fences, but by opening them. Not by returning to old routines, but by writing new ones. Ones that included paws, hooves, feathers, and fur. The animals they'd saved had not just been rescued, they had rescued something in the people too. The part that had gone numb, the part that had once believed kindness was optional, and now it was woven into everything. In the new names given, in the daily rituals of care, in the way the town had stopped asking, "Why should we?" and started asking, "How could we not?" Because after the waters had taken so much, kindness had returned something even greater, a reason to keep choosing one another. And that choice, made in quiet corners and muddy pastures, in makeshift shelters and broken barns, began to shape the soul of the town more deeply than any tragedy ever could. They no longer measured success in what they rebuilt with their hands, but in what they rebuilt with their hearts. The grocery store kept a box of old blankets by the door, for strays. The school children drew pictures, not just of family, but of animals they had helped save. And even the oldest residents, those who had once scoffed at all this fuss over creatures, now sat with bowls beside them, murmuring stories into soft ears. The flood had left a scar, but kindness had turned that scar into a landmark, a place that said, "Here, we chose love anyway." And it wasn't temporary, it lived on in the generations who would be told the story, not of the flood, but of the saving, of how a small, forgotten town remembered something ancient, that when you open your hands to the vulnerable, you don't just shelter them, you heal something in yourself too. And that healing wasn't loud. It didn't come with headlines or parades. It showed up quietly, like a child who now fed the stray that once cowered behind a collapsed shed. Like a man who had once locked his barn without care, now leaving it open for birds who'd lost their nests. Like the mayor who added a new line to the town's motto, "No soul left behind." It was in the way people walked slower, noticed more, in the way a muddy paw print on a porch didn't feel like a mess, but a memory, in how old rivalries softened when a neighbor shared her only can of food, not with another person, but with a shivering, soaked cat she didn't even like. Because now it wasn't about liking, it was about choosing to care anyway. And that shift was irreversible. It meant they would never again be the town that waited for help to come. They would be the help, the hands, the hope, because they had seen what happened when you don't turn away, when you stop asking who deserves it most, and just start saving what you can. And when that became the instinct, not the exception, something extraordinary unfolded. The town didn't return to normal, it evolved. Fences once meant to keep things out became markers of shared space. Roads, once paths of escape, became routes of return for lost pets, for wild creatures, for people who had once left and now longed to come home. And rescue wasn't just a word anymore. It was a rhythm, a habit, a quiet vow they lived by, one that echoed in every rebuilt barn, every blanket left on a porch for strays, every child taught to extend a hand before raising a voice. They didn't call it a miracle. They called it Monday, because it kept happening, because they kept showing up. And in doing so, they redefined what it meant to be a town, not by how many buildings stood, but by how many hearts were open. In the aftermath of the flood, as the community gathered in quiet solidarity, it wasn't the rebuilt buildings or washed-away streets that defined their recovery. It was the warmth in every gesture, the unspoken promise in every open heart. Neighbors learned to greet each other with gentle smiles and soft words, to leave their doors ajar as beacons of hope rather than barriers. Even the once-forgotten souls on the fringes of the town found that someone cared enough to listen, to share a meal, to offer comfort without expectation. Every rescued animal, every shared blanket, every moment when someone paused to help a stray creature became a testament to that quiet revolution. The town wasn't measured by how high it could raise its walls against the storm, but by how wide it could open its arms when it mattered most. In each open heart, a light flickered, a promise that no one would be left to face despair alone. That delicate but persistent glow spread quietly, like ripples in a still pond, touching lives in ways that no grand monument could ever capture. In that gentle aftermath, when the storm had finally subsided and the scars of loss began to fade into memory, what endured was the collective courage to care. It was seen in the neighbor who spent evenings by the window waiting for a lost pet to return, in the teacher who organized community art projects to honor rescued animals, and in the quiet determination of strangers who became friends over shared hardship. This was the measure of true recovery, a community built on empathy where the depth of connection was counted not in dollars or bricks, but by the number of hearts that were open. And so, with every open heart, the town forged a new chapter. One where the echoes of the past mingled with the promise of the future. A future defined not by the calamities it survived, but by the kindness it sowed. As the seasons changed and the waters receded, the town stood, not just rebuilt, but reborn. It hadn't returned to what it was. It had become something more. Because healing isn't about erasing what happened. It's about what we choose to become because of it. The animals that once cowered in barns and treetops now walked alongside the very people who refused to forget them. Some stayed, becoming companions, family, symbols of a bond that couldn't be washed away. Others were released back to the wild, but never without a quiet goodbye. Each rescue had left an imprint. Each act of mercy had shaped a new way of living, and in the end, it wasn't just about saving animals. It was about what those animals taught the town in return, about loyalty, resilience, and the beauty of showing up for those who cannot ask. They reminded everyone that compassion isn't a weakness. It's the very thing that holds a fractured world together. They came together because of a flood. They stayed together because of what they found in each other. And now they would never see their world the same way again. Because kindness, when chosen again and again, can turn even the worst storm into the beginning of something sacred. Moved by this story? Share it. Subscribe for more. Because kindness is contagious.